In 1989, a beloved night janitor named Robert vanished without a trace from Lincoln Elementary School, leaving behind two young daughters and a mystery that would haunt their small community for over a decade. The 45-year-old single father had simply disappeared into the darkness of a cold February evening, his keys still hanging from the supply closet door, his thermos of coffee still warm on the windowsill of the principal's office where he'd been working. But 12 years later, when construction workers began renovating the old school's crumbling infrastructure, they would make a discovery so shocking it would finally reveal the devastating truth about what happened to Robert. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story of Robert's disappearance began like so many workplace mysteries, with the simple observation that a reliable man had failed to show up for work. Margaret Chun, the school secretary who had worked at Lincoln Elementary for nearly 20 years, arrived that Wednesday morning in February expecting to find the building clean and organized, just as Robert left it every night. Instead, she found something that made her blood run cold. The hallways were only half mopped, classroom trash cans sat unemptied, and Robert's cleaning cart stood abandoned in the middle of the main corridor, its contents scattered as if he had dropped everything and run down. Margaret's first instinct was concern rather than suspicion. Robert Martinez was not the kind of man who abandoned his responsibilities, not the kind of father who would disappear without ensuring his daughters were safe. She had watched him work for 3 years, had seen him arrive each evening at 6 o'clock sharp with his two girls in tow, settling them in the library with their homework while he began his methodical cleaning routine. 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Carmen had become as much a part of Lincoln Elementary's evening routine as Robert himself, their quiet voices echoing through the empty hallways as they practiced spelling words or worked through math problems. Under the warm glow of the library's reading lamps, when Margaret called Robert's apartment that morning, the phone rang endlessly into silence. When she drove to his small duplex on Maple Street after school, she found his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, sitting on her front porch with a worried expression that mirrored Margaret's own growing fear. The girls had never come home the night before, Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken dread. She had assumed Robert was working late, maybe dealing with some emergency at the school, but when morning came and there was still no sign of them, she had begun to suspect something terrible had happened. The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless, hampered by the lack of witnesses and the apparent absence of any obvious motive for Robert's disappearance. Detective Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force who had handled dozens of missing person cases, found herself struggling to piece together a coherent narrative from the scattered evidence. Robert's car was found parked in its usual spot behind the school, keys missing, no signs of struggle or forced entry. His wallet was gone, but his bank account showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to his disappearance. Most puzzling of all, there was no indication that Robert had been planning to leave or that he was involved in anything that might have put him in danger. The search for Robert and his daughters consumed the small community of Millbrook for weeks. Volunteers combed through nearby woods and abandoned buildings, posted flyers on every street corner, organized candlelight vigils that drew hundreds of concerned citizens. Local television stations picked up the story, broadcasting Robert's photograph alongside appeals for information that generated dozens of tips, but no concrete leads. The FBI was eventually called in to investigate the possibility of kidnapping, but their extensive interviews with Robert's coworkers, neighbors, and friends revealed nothing that might explain his sudden disappearance. What emerged from those interviews, however, was a portrait of a man whose dedication to his family and his work had earned him the respect and affection of everyone who knew him. Robert had been working as Lincoln Elementary's night janitor for 3 years, ever since his wife Maria had died in a car accident, leaving him to raise Sophia and Carmen alone. The job paid modest wages, but it offered him something more valuable than money: the flexibility to care for his daughters during the day and the opportunity to work in an environment where they could safely spend their evenings while he cleaned. Principal William Hartwell spoke eloquently about Robert's work ethic and character during those early interviews, describing him as a man who took genuine pride in maintaining the school environment where the community's children learned and grew. Hartwell, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s who had been leading Lincoln Elementary for over a decade, emphasized Robert's reliability and his obvious love for his daughters. "He was more than just our janitor," Hartwell told reporters, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine grief. "Robert was part of our school family, and those little girls were like mascots to all of us. We're praying for their safe return." The teachers at Lincoln Elementary echoed Hartwell's sentiments, describing how Robert would often linger after, completing his cleaning duties to help with special projects or repairs that the school district's limited budget couldn't accommodate. Third-grade teacher Nancy Phillips remembered how Robert had spent an entire weekend repainting her classroom's reading corner, refusing payment and insisting that anything that helped the children was worth doing. "He understood that his work mattered," Phillips said, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to investigators. Robert knew that a clean, well-maintained school made learning easier for these kids, many of whom were dealing with difficult circumstances at home. Indeed, Lincoln Elementary served one of Millbrook's most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, where many families struggled with poverty, unemployment, and the various social problems that accompanied economic hardship. The school's free lunch program fed nearly 80% of its students, and teachers regularly used their own money to buy supplies and clothing for children whose families couldn't afford them. Robert had fit naturally into this environment of caring adults who went above and beyond their job descriptions to help vulnerable children, and his disappearance left a void that extended far beyond the practical matter of keeping the building cleaned. As weeks turned to months with no sign of Robert or his daughters, the investigation began to focus on the possibility that they had been victims of foul play. Detective Morrison explored every angle she could think of, from the possibility that Robert had witnessed a crime to the chance that he had become involved with dangerous people through some aspect of his life that his friends and coworkers knew nothing about. She interviewed Robert's former colleagues at the warehouse where he had worked before taking the janitor position, delved into his financial records, and even investigated whether his late wife's family might have taken the children in some misguided custody dispute. The breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for never came, and eventually, the case began to receive less attention from both the police and the media. Robert Martinez and his daughters joined the ranks of missing persons whose disappearances remained unsolved mysteries, their photographs filed away in evidence boxes, and their case numbers added to databases that cataloged the unexplained vanishings that occurred across the country every year. For the staff and students at Lincoln Elementary, life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though Robert's absence remained a constant reminder of how suddenly tragedy could strike even the most innocent lives. The school district hired a new janitor, an older man named Frank who did competent work but lacked Robert's personal investment in the school community. The hallways were cleaned just as thoroughly, the trash cans emptied just as regularly, but something intangible had been lost. Teachers noticed the difference in small ways, the missing attention to detail that had made Robert's work special, the absence of the quiet pride he had taken in creating an environment where children could thrive. Most of all, they missed the sound of Sophia and Carmen's voices echoing through the empty corridors, the sight of their small figures hunched over homework at the library tables, the way their presence had made the school feel more like a home than an institution. Margaret Shun, who had been the first to discover Robert's disappearance, found herself particularly affected by the unresolved mystery. She had developed a genuine fondness for Robert and his daughters during their time at Lincoln Elementary, and their sudden absence left her with a persistent sense of unfinished business that she couldn't shake. In quiet moments, when the school was empty and she was finishing her own work for the day, Margaret would find herself wondering what had really happened to the Martinez family and whether the truth might someday emerge from whatever darkness had swallowed them. The years that followed brought changes to Lincoln Elementary and the community it served, but the memory of Robert Martinez and his daughters remained a part of the school's unofficial history. New teachers who joined the staff would eventually hear the story from their colleagues, usually during quiet moments in the faculty lounge, when conversation turned to the various tragedies and triumphs that had shaped the school over the decades. Some of these newer staff members would express surprise that such a mystery had never been solved, while others would nod knowingly, understanding that some questions simply had no answers and that life often moved forward without providing the closure that human hearts craved. Principal Hartwell continued to lead Lincoln Elementary with the same dedication he had shown before Robert's disappearance, guiding the school through budget cuts, curriculum changes, and the various challenges that faced public education in economically disadvantaged communities. His leadership during the crisis following Robert's disappearance had earned him additional respect from both his staff and the parents of his students, and he was frequently cited as an example of how educational administrators could provide stability and support during difficult times. Under his guidance, Lincoln Elementary maintained its reputation as a school where caring adults worked tirelessly to help children overcome the obstacles that poverty and family instability placed in their paths. The building itself began to show its age as the years passed, and by the late 1990s, it was clear that Lincoln Elementary was in need of significant renovations. The heating system struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures during winter months, the roof leaked in several places, and the electrical system was becoming increasingly unreliable. Parents and teachers organized fundraising efforts to supplement the school district's limited renovation budget, but it became apparent that only a comprehensive overhaul would address the building's mounting problems. In the summer of 2001, 12 years after Robert Martinez had vanished into the night, construction crews arrived at Lincoln Elementary to begin the most extensive renovation in the school's history. The project would take months to complete and would require rebuilding entire sections of the building's infrastructure, from the foundation to the roof. Workers would strip walls down to their studs, replace decades-old plumbing and electrical systems, and modernize classrooms to meet contemporary educational standards. The renovation project was led by Thompson Construction, a local company that specialized in institutional buildings and had earned a reputation for quality work and attention to detail. Project foreman Jake Thompson, whose own children had attended Lincoln Elementary, approached the job with personal investment that went beyond professional obligation. He understood that this building served children who often had few advantages in life, and he was determined that the renovation would create an environment where they could learn and grow without distraction from inadequate facilities. The early stages of the renovation proceeded without incident, as workers focused on updating the electrical system and replacing worn flooring throughout the building. The construction crew, most of whom were longtime Millbrook residents, took pride in their work and often commented on how much the improvements would mean to the children who would return to the renovated school when classes resumed. Several of the workers had their own memories of Robert Martinez, having met him during his years as Lincoln Elementary's janitor, and they approached their work with a sense of contributing to the community that had been touched by his mysterious disappearance. As the renovation progressed into its third month, workers began focusing on the building's heating system, which required extensive modifications to bring it up to current safety and efficiency standards. The boiler room, located in the basement beneath the school's main office, had been virtually untouched for decades and represented one of the most challenging aspects of the entire project. The space was cramped and poorly lit, filled with outdated equipment and layers of pipes and ducts that had been added piecemeal over the years as various repairs and upgrades had been attempted. It was during this phase of the renovation that the construction crew encountered the first signs that Lincoln Elementary held secrets within its walls. While removing old insulation from around the boiler system, workers noticed that several bricks in the basement's east wall seemed loose, as if they had been disturbed at some point in the past. The mortar around these bricks was a slightly different color than the surrounding wall, suggesting that they had been removed and replaced relatively recently. Certainly within the past decade or two, Jake Thompson examined the loose bricks with the practiced eye of someone who had worked on dozens of old buildings throughout his career. What he saw puzzled him, because the replacement work appeared to have been done carefully and skillfully, not like the hasty repair job that might result from routine maintenance or emergency fixes. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to remove these particular bricks and replace them in a way that would be virtually unnoticeable to casual observation. The only reason the construction crew had discovered the irregularity was because their work required them to examine every inch of the basement walls as they installed new heating equipment. Curiosity overcame caution, and Thompson decided to investigate further. Using careful pressure and the right tools, he and his crew were able to remove the loose bricks without damaging them. revealing a cavity in the wall that had been deliberately created to serve as a hiding place. The space behind the bricks was approximately 12 inches wide, 18 inches tall, and about 8 inches deep, just large enough to conceal objects that someone had wanted to keep safe from discovery. Thompson directed his flashlight into the dark recess, expecting to find nothing more than old building materials or perhaps some forgotten maintenance supplies. What the beam of his flashlight illuminated instead would change everything anyone thought they knew about Robert Martinez and his mysterious disappearance. The hiding place contained items that had clearly been placed there with great care and deliberation, items that suggested someone had been conducting a secret investigation. Right under the noses of everyone at Lincoln Elementary, Thompson realized immediately that he was looking at evidence that might finally solve a 12-year-old mystery, evidence that someone had died to protect. The construction foreman's hands trembled slightly as he considered the implications of his discovery. He understood that whatever was hidden behind those bricks was connected to Robert Martinez's disappearance, and he suspected that revealing its contents would expose truths that certain people had worked very hard to keep buried. Thompson also realized that his crew had stumbled upon evidence in what might still be considered an active criminal case, and he knew that proper procedures would need to be followed to ensure that any investigation could proceed without compromise. After carefully documenting the location and condition of the hiding place with photographs, Thompson called Detective Morrison, who had led the original investigation into Robert's disappearance and who still carried his case file among her unsolved mysteries. Morrison, now a lieutenant with over 30 years of experience, felt her pulse quicken when Thompson described what his crew had found. She had never completely given up hope that someday new evidence would emerge to explain what had happened to Robert Martinez and his daughters. But she had not expected that evidence to be literally built into the walls of Lincoln Elementary School. Within hours of Thompson's call, the basement of Lincoln Elementary was transformed into a crime scene, with investigators carefully processing the area around the hidden cavity and its contents. The renovation work was temporarily suspended as police photographers documented every angle of the discovery, and evidence technicians began the painstaking process of cataloging what Robert Martinez had hidden behind those bricks in the months or weeks before his disappearance. Detective Morrison found herself experiencing a mixture of professional excitement and personal dread as she supervised the evidence recovery process. After 12 years of wondering what had happened to Robert and his daughters, she was finally going to learn the truth, but she suspected that truth would be more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The care with which the hiding place had been constructed and concealed suggested that Robert had been investigating something significant, something dangerous enough that he had felt the need to create a secret repository for evidence that he feared might otherwise be destroyed. As news of the discovery spread through Millbrook, the community that had mourned Robert Martinez's disappearance 12 years earlier found itself reliving the mystery with renewed intensity. Local media outlets reported that new evidence had been found related to the case, though police declined to reveal specific details while their investigation was ongoing. Residents who had participated in the original search efforts felt a complicated mix of hope and anxiety, wondering whether the truth about Robert's fate would finally emerge and what that truth might reveal about people and institutions they had trusted. Margaret Chun, still working as Lincoln Elementary's secretary after all these years, felt particularly emotional about the discovery in the school's basement. She had never forgotten Robert Martinez or his daughters, and she had always suspected that there was more to their disappearance than a simple case of a man abandoning his responsibilities. The revelation that Robert had been conducting some kind of secret investigation vindicated her instinct that he had been involved in something significant, though she could not yet imagine what that something might have been. Principal Hartwell, now in his 60s but still leading Lincoln Elementary with the same dedication he had shown throughout his career, expressed cautious optimism that the new evidence might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the school community for over a decade. In a statement to local media, he emphasized his hope that Robert's family would finally learn the truth about what had happened to him and his daughters, and he pledged the school's full cooperation with the renewed investigation. The contents of Robert's hiding place would not be fully processed and analyzed for several more days, as investigators worked methodically to ensure that every piece of evidence was properly documented and preserved. Detective Morrison understood that this might be her only opportunity to solve the case that had frustrated her for 12 years, and she was determined that no detail would be overlooked and no procedural error would compromise the investigation. During those days of waiting, as rumors and speculation circulated through Millbrook about what Robert Martinez might have discovered, the community found itself reconsidering everything it thought it knew about his disappearance. The image of Robert as a simple janitor who had vanished without explanation was giving way to a more complex picture of a man who had apparently been conducting a dangerous investigation while maintaining his facade as a devoted father and reliable employee. The question that everyone was asking was what Robert had learned that was significant enough to kill four, and who had been threatened enough by his investigation to resort to murder. The answer to those questions lay waiting in the evidence that had been carefully extracted from Lincoln Elementary's basement, evidence that would soon reveal a conspiracy of greed and corruption that had reached into the highest levels of the school's administration. Robert Martinez had died because he had discovered that people entrusted with caring for the community's most vulnerable children were instead exploiting them for personal gain, and his hidden evidence would finally expose the full scope of their betrayal. Detective Morrison knew that processing Robert's evidence would require patience and attention to detail, but she also understood that the community deserved answers as quickly as possible. 12 years of uncertainty had taken a toll on everyone who had known and cared about Robert Martinez, and Morrison was determined that the truth, however disturbing it might prove to be, would finally be revealed. The evidence analysis began. With a careful inventory of everything that had been concealed behind the loose bricks in Lincoln Elementary's basement, Robert Martinez had created a comprehensive archive of documents, photographs, and other materials that told the story of his investigation into activities that he clearly believed were both illegal and morally reprehensible. The organization and thoroughness of his documentation suggested that Robert had been building a case that he intended to present to authorities, though he had apparently been murdered before he could do so. Morrison and her team worked through the evidence systematically, beginning with what appeared to be Robert's earliest discoveries and following the progression of his investigation through increasingly damaging revelations. What emerged was a picture of systematic fraud that had been ongoing for years, involving the manipulation of federal and state programs designed to help economically disadvantaged children. The scope and audacity of the scheme surprised even veteran investigators who had seen numerous cases of institutional corruption throughout their careers. The documentary evidence that Robert had assembled revealed a complex web of financial manipulation centered around Lincoln Elementary's participation in various government assistance programs. The school received substantial federal funding for its free lunch program, which served the vast majority of its students, as well as additional grants and subsidies designed to help schools serving low-income communities. These programs represented hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, money that was supposed to ensure that the community's most vulnerable children received adequate nutrition and educational support. Robert's investigation had uncovered evidence that significant portions of this funding were being diverted from their intended purposes and used instead to enrich individuals who had been entrusted with the responsibility of administering these programs. The fraud involved falsified enrollment numbers, fictitious vendor contracts, and elaborate accounting manipulations that allowed the perpetrators to skim money from programs designed to feed hungry children and provide them with educational opportunities. The photographs that Robert had taken as part of his investigation showed various aspects of the fraudulent operation, from stage scenes designed to document non-existent program activities to images of individuals involved in the conspiracy meeting in locations where they believed they would not be observed. These photographs demonstrated Robert's skill as an investigator and his understanding of the need to provide visual evidence that would support his documentary findings. Among the most damaging pieces of evidence were financial records that Robert had somehow obtained, showing the actual costs of food and supplies compared to the amounts being claimed for reimbursement from government programs. The discrepancies were substantial and consistent, indicating that the fraud had been systematic, rather than opportunistic. Someone with access to program administration and accounting records had been carefully manipulating the numbers to create opportunities for theft while maintaining the appearance of legitimate operations that A.S. Morrison and her team worked through. Robert's evidence. They began to understand the personal risk he had taken in conducting his investigation. The people involved in the fraud held positions of authority and trust within the school system, and they had access to resources that would have made them formidable adversaries for a night janitor who was trying to expose their crimes. Robert had clearly understood the danger he faced, given the elaborate precautions he had taken to hide his evidence. But he had apparently decided that protecting the children served by Lincoln Elementary was worth the risk to his own safety. The evidence also revealed the methodical nature of Robert's investigation and his growing understanding of the full scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered. His earliest documents suggested that he had initially discovered relatively minor irregularities that had aroused his suspicion, but his investigation had gradually revealed increasingly serious crimes involving larger amounts of money and more sophisticated schemes. Robert had apparently spent months carefully documenting every aspect of the fraud, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The timeline of Robert's investigation, as revealed by dates on his documents and photographs, showed that he had been actively gathering evidence for at least 6 months before his disappearance. This meant that he had been conducting his secret investigation while maintaining his normal routine as a janitor and single father, working late into the night to document crimes that were being committed against the children he served. The dedication and courage required for such an undertaking impressed even experienced investigators who had seen many examples of civic heroism throughout their careers. One of the most significant pieces of evidence in Robert's collection was a series of audio recordings that he had made of conversations between individuals involved in the fraud. The recordings were of surprisingly good quality, suggesting that Robert had invested in proper equipment and had learned how to use it effectively. The conversations captured on these recordings provided direct evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy, including discussions of how to avoid detection and what to do if their activities were discovered by auditors or other authorities. The audio recordings also revealed the contempt that the conspirators felt for the children and families they were supposed to be helping. In several conversations, participants in the fraud made derogatory comments about the school's students and their families, expressing the belief that poor children didn't deserve the programs designed to help them, and that diverting money from these programs was therefore not really harmful. These recordings would prove particularly damaging when presented to a jury, as they demonstrated not only criminal behavior, but also a callous disregard for the welfare of vulnerable children. As the full scope of Robert's evidence became clear, Detective Morrison realized that his investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that extended beyond simple embezzlement or fraud. The people involved in stealing money from children's programs had created an elaborate criminal enterprise that required coordination between multiple individuals and institutions. Exposing this conspiracy would likely result in numerous arrests and prosecutions, and it would probably reveal corruption that reached into other areas of local government and administration. The evidence also suggested that Robert had been close to completing his investigation when he disappeared, and that he may have been planning to present his findings to federal authorities who would have the jurisdiction and resources necessary to prosecute the crimes he had uncovered. Several documents in his collection were drafts of letters to the FBI and other federal agencies, outlining his discoveries and requesting investigation of the fraud he had documented. These letters demonstrated Robert's understanding that local authorities might not be able or willing to pursue a case that involved prominent members of the community. Morrison felt a deep sense of admiration for Robert Martinez as she worked through his evidence and came to understand the scope of his investigation and the personal sacrifices he had made to protect children who were being victimized by the very people entrusted with their care. Robert had risked everything to expose corruption and theft that was harming some of society's most vulnerable members, and he had paid the ultimate price for his commitment to justice and moral courage. The detective also felt growing anger toward the individuals who had not only stolen money intended for hungry children, but had also murdered a good man to cover up their crimes. The evidence that Robert had assembled would ensure that his killers faced justice, but it could not bring him back or restore the years of childhood that his daughters had lost when they were orphaned by greed and corruption. As the investigation progressed, Morrison began to focus on identifying the specific individuals who had been involved in the fraud and determining which of them might have been responsible for Robert's murder. The evidence provided clear indication of who had been stealing money from children's programs, but proving murder would require additional investigation and possibly the cooperation of individuals who had been involved in the conspiracy but who might be willing to testify against others in exchange for reduced sentences. The task of building murder cases based on 12-year-old evidence would be challenging, but Morrison was confident that Robert's investigation provided a strong foundation for prosecuting both the financial crimes and the violence that had been used to cover them up. The thoroughness and quality of Robert's documentation would make it difficult for defendants to claim innocence or to argue that the evidence against them was insufficient to support convictions. Morrison also understood that solving Robert's murder would finally provide answers to questions that had tormented his daughters and other family members for over a decade. Sophia and Carmen Martinez, now young women in their 20s, had grown up not knowing what had happened to their father or why he had disappeared from their lives so suddenly. The truth would be painful, but it would also provide the closure that had been denied to them for too many years. The community of Millbrook would also benefit from learning the truth about Robert Martinez's disappearance, even though that truth would be disturbing and would challenge their assumptions about people and institutions they had trusted. The revelation that children had been victimized by corruption and that a good man had been murdered for trying to protect them would be shocking, but it would also demonstrate the importance of vigilance and moral courage in protecting societies. Most vulnerable members, A.S. Morrison prepared to move forward with arrests and prosecutions based on Robert's evidence. She reflected on the remarkable courage and dedication that had driven him to risk everything for the sake of children who were not even his own. Robert Martinez had embodied the best qualities of citizenship and moral responsibility, and his sacrifice had ultimately ensured that justice would be served and that the children of Lincoln Elementary would be protected from those who had exploited them. The evidence that Robert had died to protect would soon expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost him his life, and the people responsible for both the fraud and his murder would finally face the consequences of their actions. After 12 years of mystery and uncertainty, the truth about Robert Martinez would finally be revealed, and his legacy as a hero who had died protecting children would be recognized and honored by the community he had served. Detective Morrison knew that the arrests and trials that would follow would be difficult and emotionally challenging for everyone involved, but she also understood that Robert's evidence had made justice possible and that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The man who had vanished into the darkness of a February night in 1989 would finally receive the recognition he deserved as someone who had given his life to protect the innocent and expose corruption that threatened the most vulnerable members of society. The breakthrough in understanding Robert's evidence came when investigators discovered a detailed timeline he had created, documenting specific instances of fraud and identifying the individuals responsible for each aspect of the conspiracy. This timeline revealed that the corruption at Lincoln Elementary had been orchestrated primarily by Principal William Hartwell, working in conjunction with district-level administrators and several vendors who provided services to the schools. Federal assistance programs. Robert's investigation had uncovered evidence that Hartwell had been systematically inflating enrollment numbers for the free lunch program, claiming reimbursements for hundreds of meals that were never served and pocketing the difference. The principal had also created fictitious contracts with vendors who kicked back portions of their payments to him personally, while providing inferior services or products to the children who were supposed to benefit from these programs. The scope of the fraud was staggering, involving hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. The evidence also revealed that Hartwell had not been working alone in his criminal enterprise. District Food Service Director Michael Barnes had been complicit in the meal program fraud, helping to falsify records and ensure that audits did not reveal the discrepancies between claimed and actual meal service. Maintenance Supervisor Tony Ricci had participated in fraudulent repair and supply contracts, billing the district for work that was never performed and supplies that were never delivered. These men had formed a criminal conspiracy that enriched themselves while stealing resources intended for some of the community's poorest children. Robert's investigation had also uncovered evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. as the conspirators had worked to silence anyone who might expose their crimes. Several teachers and support staff had apparently noticed irregularities in program administration, but they had been discouraged from reporting their concerns through a combination of professional pressure and veiled threats. The evidence suggested that Robert himself had been subjected to increasing harassment and intimidation as his investigation progressed. Though he had continued his work despite growing personal danger, the audio recordings that Robert had made proved particularly damaging to the conspirators, as they captured conversations in which the participants discussed their criminal activities in explicit detail. In one recording, Hartwell could be heard explaining to Barnes how to manipulate meal counts to maximize fraudulent reimbursements, while another captured Ricci describing how to create fake invoices for maintenance work that would never be performed. These recordings provided direct evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy that would be virtually impossible to explain away in court. Detective Morrison was particularly struck by a recording in which the conspirators discussed what to do about Robert Martinez, whom they had apparently identified as a threat to their criminal enterprise. The conversation, which took place approximately 2 weeks before Robert's disappearance, revealed that the conspirators were aware of his investigation and were considering various options for neutralizing the threat he represented. The recording did not explicitly discuss murder, but it clearly established that Robert's death had been premeditated by individuals who saw him as an obstacle to their continued criminal activities. The evidence also revealed the extent to which the conspirators had corrupted the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of fraud they were committing. District auditors had been bribed or intimidated into overlooking obvious discrepancies, while state officials responsible for monitoring federal programs had been provided with falsified documentation that concealed the true scope of the theft. The conspiracy had created a web of corruption that extended far beyond Lincoln Elementary School itself. Morrison realized that prosecuting this case would require coordination with federal authorities, given the involvement of federally funded programs and the interstate nature of some of the criminal activities. The FBI would need to be involved in investigating the fraud aspects of the case, while local prosecutors would handle the murder charges. The complexity of the conspiracy and the multiple jurisdictions involved would make prosecution challenging, but Robert's evidence provided a strong foundation for successful convictions. The detective also understood that the case would generate significant media attention and public outrage, given the involvement of trusted public officials and the fact that the victims were primarily impoverished children. The revelation that educators and administrators had been stealing from programs designed to help hungry children would shock the community and would likely lead to demands for comprehensive reforms in oversight and accountability. Morrison was prepared for the intense scrutiny that would accompany the investigation and prosecution of such a high-profile case. As preparations for arrests began, Morrison reflected on the remarkable investigation that Robert Martinez had conducted while working as a night janitor and caring for his 2 young daughters. His dedication to exposing corruption and protecting vulnerable children had cost him his life, but it had also ensured that justice would eventually be served and that the victims of the conspiracy would be vindicated. Robert's legacy would be that of a hero who had sacrificed everything to protect the innocent and expose those who would exploit them. The arrest began on a cold morning in November, exactly 12 years and 9 months after Robert Martinez had disappeared from Lincoln Elementary School. Detective Morrison, working with federal agents and district attorneys from multiple jurisdictions, executed warrants simultaneously to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure that none of the conspirators could flee or warn others of impending prosecution. Principal William Hartwell was arrested at his home as he prepared to leave for work, his confident demeanor crumbling as federal agents informed him of the charges against him. The man who had presented himself as a dedicated educator concerned about disadvantaged children was revealed to be a criminal who had systematically stolen from the very programs designed to help those children. His arrest sent shockwaves through the education community and confirmed the worst fears of those who had suspected that Robert Martinez's disappearance was connected to corruption at Lincoln Elementary. District Food Service Director Michael Barnes was taken into custody at his office, where investigators also seized computers and files that contained additional evidence of the meal program fraud. Barnes had been a trusted administrator for over 15 years, and his involvement in the conspiracy demonstrated how corruption could penetrate even the most basic services provided to vulnerable children. His arrest revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had corrupted the district's food service operations and had deprived children of adequate nutrition. Maintenance supervisor Tony Ricci was arrested at a job site where he was overseeing work that investigators suspected was being performed under fraudulent contracts. Ricci's involvement in the conspiracy had extended beyond simple embezzlement to include the intimidation of potential witnesses and the destruction of evidence that might have exposed the criminal enterprise earlier. His arrest closed a significant gap in understanding how the conspirators had maintained their operation for so many years without detection. The arrests of these three men marked the beginning of a comprehensive investigation that would eventually result in charges against more than a dozen individuals who had participated in various aspects of the conspiracy. Some of these additional defendants were vendors who had paid kickbacks in exchange for fraudulent contracts, while others were district employees who had been complicit in falsifying records or intimidating potential witnesses. The breadth of the conspiracy shocked even experienced investigators and prosecutors who had handled numerous corruption cases throughout their careers. As news of the arrests spread through Millbrook, the community struggled to process the revelation that trusted public officials had been stealing from programs designed to help the town's poorest children. Parents who had sent their children to Lincoln Elementary during Hartwell's tenure as principal felt betrayed and angry, wondering how many meals their children had missed because money intended for food had been diverted to enrich corrupt administrators. Teachers and staff members who had worked under Hartwell's leadership questioned whether they should have recognized signs of his criminal behavior and taken action to stop it. The investigation also revealed the full scope of Robert Martinez's heroism and the price he had paid for his commitment to protecting vulnerable children. As details of his investigation became public, community members who had known Robert expressed amazement at the courage and dedication he had shown in exposing the conspiracy. The image of a simple janitor conducting a sophisticated investigation while caring for his young daughters resonated powerfully with residents who were struggling to understand how such extensive corruption had flourished in their community. Margaret Chun, who had been among the first to notice Robert's disappearance 12 years earlier, felt vindicated in her belief that there had been more to his vanishing than anyone had understood at the time. She had always suspected that Robert was too responsible and caring to simply abandon his daughters, and the revelation of his investigation confirmed her instinct that he had been involved in something significant and dangerous. Margaret also felt deep sadness at learning that Robert had been murdered for trying to protect the children he served, and she vowed to honor his memory by ensuring that Lincoln Elementary's students received the support they deserved. The criminal trials that followed the arrest would take months to complete, as prosecutors worked through the complex evidence that Robert had assembled and built cases against each of the defendants. The trials would reveal additional details of the conspiracy and would provide opportunities for the community to understand the full scope of the corruption that had been perpetrated against their children. The proceedings would also serve as a testament to Robert Martinez's courage and investigative skills, as his evidence formed the foundation for virtually every conviction that was obtained. Principal William Hartwell's trial was the most closely watched of the proceedings, given his position of trust and the central role he had played in the conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including financial records, audio recordings, and witness testimony that clearly established his guilt on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. His defense attorneys attempted to portray him as a dedicated educator who had been pressured into criminal behavior by others, but the evidence showed that he had been the primary architect of the conspiracy and had profited more than anyone else from the theft of funds intended for children. During Hartwell's trial, prosecutors played the audio recordings that Robert had made of conversations between the conspirators, providing the jury with direct evidence of the principal's criminal intent and his callous disregard for the welfare of the children he was supposed to serve. The recordings revealed Hartwell as a man who had viewed the programs designed to help disadvantaged children as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than sacred trusts that required careful stewardship. His conviction on all charges was swift and decisive, reflecting the jury's outrage at his betrayal of the community's trust. The trials of Michael Barnes and Tony Ricci followed similar patterns, with overwhelming evidence leading to quick convictions and substantial sentences. Both men had played essential roles in the conspiracy, and both had benefited significantly from the theft of funds intended for children's programs. Their convictions served as warnings to other public officials that corruption would not be tolerated and that those who betrayed the public trust would face serious consequences for their actions. The investigation and trials also revealed the murder of Robert Martinez and his daughters, though the evidence for these crimes was more circumstantial than the proof of financial fraud. Phone records and witness testimony established that Robert had been under surveillance by associates of the conspirators in the weeks before his disappearance, and forensic evidence suggested that he and his daughters had been killed and their bodies disposed of in a location that had not yet been discovered. While the murder charges were more difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, the evidence was sufficient to support additional convictions against the primary conspirators. The revelation that Sofia and Carmen Martinez had also been murdered alongside their father was particularly devastating to the community, as it demonstrated the ruthlessness of individuals who would kill innocent children to protect their criminal enterprise. The image of Robert trying to protect his daughters while conducting his investigation added an additional layer of tragedy to a case that had already shocked the community with its scope and brutality. The fact that these young girls had been murdered simply because they might have been witnesses to their father's investigation served as a stark reminder of the evil that corruption could spawn. As the trials concluded and the defendants were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, the community of Millbrook began the difficult process of healing from the trauma of learning that trusted public officials had betrayed their responsibilities so completely. The revelation that children had been victimized by those charged with their care was deeply disturbing, but it also served as a catalyst for reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. New oversight mechanisms were implemented, audit procedures were strengthened, and whistleblower protections were enhanced to encourage the reporting of suspected criminal activity. The legacy of Robert Martinez was honored through the establishment of a memorial fund that provided scholarships for students who demonstrated the kind of moral courage and commitment to justice that had characterized his life. The fund also supported programs designed to ensure that children in need received adequate nutrition and educational support, fulfilling Robert's mission of protecting vulnerable members of the community. His sacrifice was not forgotten, and his example inspired others to take action when they witnessed injustice or corruption. Lincoln Elementary School itself was renamed the Robert Martinez Elementary School in honor of the man who had given his life to protect its students. The building that had housed his investigation and witnessed his murder became a symbol of the importance of moral courage and the price that heroes sometimes pay for standing up to corruption and injustice. Students who attended the renamed school learned about Robert's story and were encouraged to follow his example of putting the welfare of others before their own safety and comfort. Detective Morrison, who had worked tirelessly to solve the case that had haunted her for over a decade, felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having finally brought justice to Robert Martinez and his daughters. The investigation had been one of the most complex and emotionally challenging of her career, but it had also demonstrated the power of determination and the importance of never giving up on victims who seemed to have been forgotten. Morrison's work had ensured that Robert's sacrifice was not in vain and that the truth about his heroism was finally revealed to the world. The case of Robert Martinez became a landmark in the prosecution of public corruption and the protection of whistleblowers who risked their lives to expose criminal activity. Legal scholars and law enforcement professionals studied the investigation and trials as examples of how complex conspiracies could be uncovered and prosecuted effectively. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of protecting individuals who come forward with evidence of corruption, as Robert's murder demonstrated the extreme lengths to which criminals will go to protect their illegal activities. Years after the trials concluded and the defendants began serving their sentences, the story of Robert Martinez continued to resonate with people who heard it. His willingness to risk everything to protect children who were not his own represented the best aspects of human nature and served as an inspiration to others who faced difficult decisions about whether to speak out against injustice. Robert's legacy lived on in the lives of the children who benefited from the programs that his investigation had helped to protect and reform. The community of Millbrook never forgot the lesson of Robert Martinez's sacrifice, and residents remained vigilant against corruption and abuse of power in their local institutions. The tragedy of his murder served as a permanent reminder that freedom and justice require constant protection by ordinary citizens who are willing to take extraordinary risks to defend the values that make society possible. Robert's story became part of the community's collective memory, passed down through generations as an example of heroism and moral courage. In the end, Robert Martinez achieved in death what he had hoped to accomplish in life: the protection of vulnerable children and the exposure of those who would exploit them for personal gain. His investigation, preserved behind loose bricks in a school basement, had survived long enough to ensure that justice was served and that his sacrifice was not forgotten. The janitor who had vanished into the night had become a hero whose legacy would endure long after his killers had been forgotten in their prison cells. The renovation of Lincoln Elementary School was completed months after the discovery that had changed everything, and students returned to classrooms that had been transformed, not just by new equipment and fresh paint, but by the knowledge of what Robert Martinez had done to protect them. The building bore his name and his legacy, serving as a constant reminder that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they are guided by love and moral courage. Sophia and Carmen Martinez, now adults who had learned the truth about their father's disappearance, found some measure of peace in knowing that he had died as a hero rather than as someone who had abandoned them. The pain of losing their father and their childhood could never be erased, but they could take pride in his courage and in the knowledge that his sacrifice had protected other children from the corruption that had cost them so much. Their father's legacy lived on in their own commitment to justice and in their determination to honor his memory through their own actions. The story of Robert Martinez serves as a reminder that justice sometimes takes years to achieve, but that truth has a way of eventually emerging from even the deepest darkness. His investigation, conducted in secret while he worked as a night janitor and cared for his young daughters, ultimately exposed a conspiracy that had victimized some of society's most vulnerable members. His courage in the face of increasing danger and his willingness to sacrifice his life to protect children he barely knew represents the very best of human nature and the power of individual action to create positive change in the world.